So, a while back I got a comment that reads as follows: "You should go talk to Destiny. I bet you guys would be able to find a lot of common ground and talk about your differences." And, that's not gonna happen. For obvious reasons that we will get to, in addition to the fact that that's just not really how I like to make content. If you've watched me here on YouTube, you've probably realized that I never really directly target anyone. And if my usual demeanor isn't any indicator of this, it isn't because I think it's mean. I wouldn't care if it's mean. I just think it's a waste of time to call people out as if you're going to be able to have a productive conversation. People can change their minds. People who put out videos and have their entire reputation and financial status intertwined with their beliefs don't. And so you're really only setting yourself up for failure by giving others a platform and by risking the backlash that you'll almost certainly face from that creator's community. But all that being said, someone else left this comment that said, if you talk about Alex O'Connor, I bet you'll get a lot of views. And I like views, although I don't think I can make a video of everything wrong that Alex O'Connor said because, well, for example, let's just watch a clip from him and see how long it takes before I find something that I think needs to be corrected.
The argument against free will, in my view, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic. The proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither.
Stop the clock. I actually don't know how long that was here recording because I didn't start the clock. That's going to be in post. But obviously I've seen this video before. This is the first video of Alex O'Connor that I ever saw. And so when you know where he is going to take this argument using this premise, this is not the law of the excluded middle. I mean, I should say, obviously, yes, the law of the excluded middle exists. And the formalized statement that Q or not Q has to be true is obviously true. You could plug in a truth table and find that that's what you get. The issue with what he's going to do with this law of logic is that he's going to take a formal rule and then sort of imply that it can be used in an informal context. I've given examples about this before in the past, for example, my video on false dichotomies. There is what negation means in formal logic, and then there is what negation means in just common language. And so an issue you can run into is ignoring that difference and thinking that the arguments you're making must necessarily fall into those formal structures rather than proving that they belong to those formal structures. For example, yesterday I was editing a video about, what was it? The ad hominem fallacy. Because there's this misconception, even among academics, that insults are the ad hominem fallacy, but not all insults are the ad hominem fallacy. If you say, the earth is round, and then you give proof, and then you say, the earth is round, idiot, same proof, same argument, doesn't change anything that you said the word idiot. And so in that, I say that insults are neither logical nor illogical. But getting back to the point, the issue here that we could have is taking specific definitions of logical and illogical. These are not the actual definitions because I think illogical is at its most gracious defined as devoid of logic. But if you wanted to, you could probably say that logical is whatever you would define it as, and then illogical is not logical. So how could I say that something is neither logical nor illogical? Well, it's the same way that I say, for example, that life isn't fair. When I say that life isn't fair, it's also not unfair, because it's not as though life is a moral actor capable of being fair or unfair. We like to think in terms of binaries, but more often than not, you need to think in terms of tertiaries, because you first have to answer whether or not something has a certain property or a certain characteristic, and then you can do a binary evaluation. And I'm probably rambling and getting off track here. I'm just a little sick, so my head's a little swimmy still. But the point is, this is not what the law of the excluded middle means. You can't just pull it out like it's some sort of trump card and say, okay, now every option that I'm going to present you either has to be true or false. Whether that's intentional or unintentional, that's just him saying, hey, I'm going to set up a series of false dichotomies and establish arguments based on false premises because law of the excluded middle.
Both, it can't be neither. We can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity. Is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else or is it completely undetermined by anything?
And so that's a false dichotomy. And not even just according to me, if you ask any academic, that is a false dichotomy. There is a third position. There is believing that free will exists in a deterministic framework. This is called compatibilism. Not only is this something that the majority of philosophers know about, this is something that the majority of philosophers believe in. From the Phil Paper survey, I believe it's 87% of philosophers believe in compatibilism. Only 11% reject the existence of free will, which is obviously something that Alex is never going to tell you because then that undermines his facade of authority. If you think to yourself, oh, well, he has a college education and he sounds like he's saying big words and acting very intelligent, very calm, and very rational, his position is fringe. It is very unpopular among academics, which you could argue is an appeal to authority, but my argument isn't that he's wrong because he's going against consensus. It's just that you need to peel back this facade of authority that he has and realize that he needs to substantiate the claims he makes, and he just really doesn't. Why is it the case that either we are determined by external events or we are not? Why is it not the case instead that we are influenced by external events but ultimately still make our own choices? As you'll see, these are not questions he answers, but let's just play out the full video.
Activity. Is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? Either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with the religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. It's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Oh my god. I kind of forgot how bad that argument was. Okay, so first, if it's undetermined by anything, then it's random and you are by definition not in control of what is random. That, I don't even know where to start. That's just a false premise, and a horrendously bad false premise. You know, here I could ask why something is random if it's uncaused, and why it is by definition out of our control if it's random, but I think it's more important to just emphasize that randomness is not a thing. I know that may be controversial, but if you ask a determinist what is random, you're not going to get an answer, because according to determinism, is the throw of a dice random? No, it's deterministic. Maybe they'll argue that they believe that there are random events, for example, on the quantum level, but then that gets into some very interesting things that you guys will hopefully see here soon. I don't know how my upload schedule is going to be, but I have a video in the works talking about quantum mechanics and physics and in the world of free will. And there's a very interesting theorem by Conway and Cochin, and it's called the strong free will theorem. I'm not going to try to explain it here, but essentially the conclusion is that if we have free will, then so do particles. And I know that sounds like an absurd conclusion that many of you would argue hurts the argument of free will, but I think it's something that we have to concede of any Bell-like theorem, whether it's the EPR paradox, Bell's theorem, or Conway's strong free will theorem. A very simple thought experiment goes like this. If two particles become entangled, then the spin of one can be known by observation of the other because it's going to be the opposite spin. So something interesting happens when you take these two particles and you form a space-like separation of them, which is to say that you take them further away than information can travel at the speed of light. Then the question becomes, what happens when you observe one particle? Well, based on what we know, you should instantaneously know the spin of the other particle. But how can this be? We separated the two experiments further than the speed of light can travel, which means there's no medium by which classical information can be conveyed. In terms of quantum mechanics, this proves that there are no local hidden variables. That is, of course, at least if the experimenters have free will. If not, then there's some vague argument you can make that this is all deterministic because it's all determined by prior material conditions, the choices that they make in setting up these conditions for these experiments. Now, obviously, this explanation doesn't suffice to completely explain Conway's strong free will theorem, but it's an explanation that he uses in his lectures on his free will theorem. And since it's pretty much the same argument that is made in the EPR paradox and in Bell's theorem, I think we have to conclude that the conclusions you draw from that have to be true. That either free will does not exist and the particles are deterministic, or that free will exists and there is some way in which particles respond to observation. Some people will get really nitpicky and angry about this and say, oh, well, it doesn't have to be conscious observation, though, because the Copenhagen interpretation doesn't necessitate conscious observation. I think that's copium, because, like, what other form of observation is epistemologically obtainable by conscious beings? But that's besides the point. And frankly, I'm not sure if in all my ramblings I even remember what the point was, but essentially, if people are deterministic, then so are particles. If people have free will, then so do particles. Or at least, I would say particles respond in a way to our free will. So the stochastic indeterminist rejection of free will does not work, because you can't say particles are random, but people are not. No, particles can only be random if people are random, and we know through observation that people are not random. There isn't just an indefinite probability that someone from a family of alcoholism may suffer from alcoholism. And when you're looking at particles being random and you're saying people are also random, how do you get sort of the deterministic laws of the universe that we know exist? If particles are random, then why do they coalesce in predictable ways? But then also somehow the principles of our reality decoalesce to make people random, such that you get this this consistency with what we understand necessarily has to be true with quantum mechanics? The answer is you can't. It doesn't make any sense. And so it's intellectually dishonest when people like Alex come along and say, oh, well, if it's uncaused, then it's random, and if it's random, then it can't be caused by the self. Because randomness doesn't exist. It doesn't exist from your perspective as a determinist. It doesn't exist from my perspective as a compatibilist. There are either external deterministic events that we don't fully understand, like the toss of dice, where we say that's random. That's one kind of randomness. And then the other kind of randomness, you can say that if an event is uncaused and it terminates in the self, well, that's just random. But I would turn around and say, well, it terminates in the self, so that's self-caused, that's free will. I mean, this entire argument is just insanely bad, because I've heard that Alex O'Connor accuses compatibilists of playing word games, but this is just a word game right here in and of itself. You can't just make an argument in which you arbitrarily decide that uncaused events have to be random and therefore can't be caused by the self. You're just creating your own definitions that intentionally exclude free will, and then you come to the conclusion that free will cannot exist. And as for his argument of pushing the argument back, that's just circular reasoning. It is the indeterminist position that once we arrive at the self, we say, there you go, that's uncaused. And so here at the end, this entire argument just becomes, if I assume that everything must have a cause, then all things are caused by prior material conditions. But the issue is that's just a rephrasing of the determinist position, which is the thing you're arguing. You can't just say that determinism is true because if we assume that it's true, then obviously it's true. Well, no duh, if you assume that it's true, then it's true. The issue is in assuming that it's true. Why do we need to push the question back? Why do we need to ask, okay, if it's internal to the self, what causes the self? No, don't ask that question. Or at least I should say, you can ask that question, but you shouldn't think that that question proves that you're right. This very flawed line of reasoning that a lot of determinists have, I use and I take and I say, okay, if you're saying that we have to keep pushing back to find out where our choices come from, then we can't just settle at the first prior material condition that causes them. We have to go back to the material condition that causes that material condition. And we have to keep going back through cause and effect. And the question becomes, where does that end? Well, that's a ridiculous question. It doesn't end. Because if it does, and for example, there is a boundary explanation of the Big Bang, then there is a first cause. And it's not absurd to think that you don't have to go back and constantly ask what's the cause of this, because eventually you'll arrive at an uncaused event. Why can't choice then be an uncaused event? Why can't the self be uncaused? And so if you say, okay, well then that opens the door to free will, I have to say that there isn't a first uncaused event, it just goes back and back and back and back, then in that you have created a series which itself is uncaused. The series infinitely regresses forever. This mentality is flawed. It doesn't work. It defeats itself. So you can't just say that pushes the question back as if we have to keep asking the question. It doesn't work to keep asking the question when we're talking about the origin of the universe, because eventually you either go back to a beginning or the question is never answered. You can't suddenly expect that to change here. And so that just leaves us with the soul isn't important to free will because it just explains the mechanisms of free will. Before we get to that, I want to just go ahead and play the next video.
If religious people believe that their dead loved ones go to a place called heaven, and indeed that this place called heaven is a much better and more comfortable place than down here on earth, then why do they get so upset when their loved ones die? People like to say, of course we believe they're going to heaven, but we're really sad about the fact that we're going to be separated from them until we get to heaven too. Think of it this way. Say your best friend decides that they're going to go on a scientific expedition. They're getting on a rocket and they're flying off to Mars. And because of some kind of communication technology problem, you'll never be able to contact them ever again. You're probably going to be quite upset about this. Compare this to the feeling you would have if upon getting in that spaceship, it explodes and you know that your friend has been instantly killed. Are you more upset by this? Probably you are going to be more upset by this. And if that's the case, then the thing that you're sad about can't just be that you're going to miss them until you meet them in heaven. It must be something about the death itself which fills you with grief. Notice how Jordan Peterson answers questions about religion. He'll often say that although people claim to be atheists, they don't act like atheists. He's suggesting something plausible, that well, you might say that you believe one thing, but if you're acting in a different way, maybe you're actually a little bit confused about what your own beliefs are. In other words, in the same way that Jordan Peterson might like to say that atheists are actually a bit more religious than they think, I think this kind of example can show that maybe religious people are a bit less religious than they think.
Good God, I know this is really gonna piss people off, my reactions, but listening to him hurts. Because the reason I'm tying this video with the other one is, I used to give him the benefit of the doubt. When I first became aware of who he was, I was like, okay, maybe he just has some bad arguments, but I don't want to rush to judgment about, who he is as an intellectual, as a person. But he's the very reason, and I don't want to give him this credit, but it's just the truth. He's the very reason I formulated sort of my explanation of the archetypical secular dogmatist. Basically, basically another word for Reddit atheist. He is the reason I learned that people like this do not understand metaphysics. Because first, finishing the previous video before we get into this one, the argument that the soul isn't important to the discussion of free will, I don't know how you can be that ignorant or that uneducated. Because you don't even need a college education. You don't even need to have taken a single philosophy course to understand that if you're saying something operates by physical law, that's going to be different from something that operates by transcendental, mystical laws. And so people like him just clearly do not understand metaphysics. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of metaphysical doctrine that's just complete and utter nonsense, and you should reject it. And also at the same time, people could criticize me by saying, okay, if you're accepting that some of it is nonsense, then how do you understand nonsense? It's nonsense by definition. But I think the answer to that is quite simple. You should be able to follow the rules that people set up for themselves and be able to reiterate those rules. If I have a function here that is, I give you 1 and it outputs 2, I give you 2 and it outputs 4, I give you 3 and it outputs 6, well, we know that function is 2x. But if I give you a function where 1 gives you 5, 2 gives you 7, 3 gives you 2, I'm just making up numbers, I'm sure there's probably some function you could find. But the point is, I don't even have to have a function in mind for you to go back and say, okay, but you gave me this input for that output. You can understand sort of the limits and the outline of a concept that doesn't make any sense. So when you just completely miss the point like this, and don't even understand that these completely different concepts operate by different principles, then you just have no idea what you're talking about. And you only have these beliefs because you cannot make an informed decision about what you believe because you don't understand it. People like this aren't atheists because they actually believe that God doesn't exist. They just physically cannot understand the argument of God such to have an informed position of whether or not he exists or not. They don't reject free will because they actually think that free will doesn't exist. They are aware of the fact that they make choices, but to them, they over-intellectualize it and say, well, obviously, since I accept as being true that the world operates based on these very naive and very childish physicalist principles, well then everything must logically follow from that. That free will also has to follow these deterministic principles, and so free will cannot exist. And so specifically where I pull this from this second video I showed you guys, it's the fact that he thinks the arguments that Christians make, he thinks that that's them saying, oh, well, you subconsciously think you're wrong. Why on earth would that matter as an argument? Why would doubt prove that something is true? It doesn't. And so that's not a flaw in their argument because that's not the argument they're making. And it should be said that I'm saying this as someone who doesn't agree with the argument that Christians make here, but at least I understand it and can engage with it. There is an idea that comes from the Bible and is very heavily represented in the works of Aquinas that says that the law of God is written on the hearts of man. And so what Christians are saying is that people have innate knowledge of the existence of God. When you question yourself, it isn't you doubting yourself as a materialist being. It is you doubting yourself as a spiritual being who already has mystical knowledge as to the existence of God. And so it's laughably ridiculous to turn around and then say, well, Christians mourn their loved ones when they die, so they're more atheistic than they would like to think. According to what objective standard? You can't have anamnesis in a secularist position. So, other than just doubting themselves, what's going on there? Nothing. They're just doubting themselves, and that doesn't prove anything. And for a lot of this, I'm just repeating what I've already said in previous TikToks, because back when I used to react to people more, I reacted to these videos. But something I never even touched on is that this rocket example, it's god-awful. First, even if we ignore everything I said about doubt not proving anything from a secularist position, this conflates doubt with selfishness and assumes that all Christians are perfect people. They're not. Just because they want someone back for their own purposes, for their own selfish intent, doesn't mean that they doubt that the person is actually there. And in fact, this is true of all circumstances of death, regardless of your religious affiliation. If you're an atheist and you have a loved one who's dying of some painful disease and slowly withering away, I think you're gonna feel sad when that person finally dies. And in that, mourning is selfish. Typically I don't think that nothingness is preferable to pain, but a lot of people do. And so if you're an atheist and you have someone who's slowly dying in a painful way and you mourn when that person dies, that's not the right thing to do. The right thing to do under these assumptions that it's better to no longer exist than to exist in pain is to be thankful that the person you love is no longer suffering. But that's not what people do. People are selfish, but that doesn't mean they don't believe in God. And I mean, just in general, I find this argument very funny because, like, a couple months ago, I went to my grandfather's funeral and no one was crying because he was an old man who lived his life and all of his Christian friends believed that he was in a better place, and so nobody was upset. Like, this is just not even true. And so it's just like a really, really bad argument, especially considering if you want to get deeper into theology, which I doubt Alex O'Connor has ever actually been academically honest enough to do. The Christian apologist position is that death is a consequence of original sin. Death isn't supposed to happen, and that's why it's bad when it does happen. Just because Christians believe that the pain of death is met with eternal salvation doesn't mean that death isn't painful, that death isn't, for all intents and purposes, a mistake. That, for example, when someone who is young has their life cut short, that was them having their life cut short. And I mean, I'm sure there are arguments you could make against that, but it would just be nice if, at the very least, Alex O'Connor could engage with what people actually believe, instead of just making up complete Reddit atheist nonsense. But, I mean, what should I expect? Because I wanted to find a third video to react to, and I actually had to go through a couple of videos, because the first video that I just kind of randomly chose, it was a video of him talking to AI, debating AI, and I was like, okay, you know, this is kind of interesting, I guess. And so I picked a couple of other videos and I watched them and I was like, oh, well, you know, I didn't really have any problems with these. But I'm kind of a rule of three guy, so I was like, okay, I still need to find a video that I can react to. So I was looking for something that I could agree with, but then say, oh, well, I agree with this, and Alex O'Connor isn't that bad. See, he has this good point, and I agree with this, blah, 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 blah. And so I clicked on this video right here. And I thought by the title of it that I was going to agree with it. And suddenly, in like a bittersweet validation, I remembered why I hate Reddit atheists. There is a pretty reasonable epistemological argument that you can make. You can ask a Christian or anyone who believes in any sort of salvation through faith, how do I know which faith is correct? You know, controversially for my Christian audience, this is why I don't subscribe to a lot of those ideas. Because I look at my life and I say, okay, well, I was brought up in the church just because my family is Christian. Halfway across the world, there's someone who has an entirely different faith and believes in it for the same exact reasons. And you know, this is something that is even argued within Christianity. There is this belief among Christians I've heard before that the world cannot end until missionaries reach North Sentinel Island. Or at least I think that's the island. It's an island where there have been no outsiders. Nobody from the outside world has ever gone to that island. Because if you go there on boat, they'll shoot you with arrows. If you fly over, the bottom of your plane is going to have arrows. And so I've heard even Christians say, you know, the world cannot end until they get their fair shake. And I think even within maybe older traditions within Catholicism, I don't know if these are practiced anymore, but there's the idea that if you were never exposed to Christianity, there's purgatory where you get a chance to be exposed to Christianity and accept it as true, or, you know, whatever. All I'm saying is that there are those arguments, and we have to concede that those arguments are good because those are even arguments that Christians themselves are concerned with. And then there are like the Ricky Gervais, oh, you know, all these other religions reject all these other gods, all I do is reject one more. Well, all of these religions also believe in God. Different gods, yes, but by the same rationale, you're the odd one out there for not believing in any kind of God. And that has always been my biggest problem with atheists. They take what is a really good agnostic argument for why they don't have to believe a certain way, and they turn it into this bastardized nonsense of why they believe the opposite instead. And so here, Alex O'Connor is no exception.
The populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. What can better explain this geographical spread? Theism or atheism?
Probably theism. Yeah, once we look past the weird posturing of calling Buddhism non-theistic, which apparently is a common thing. I did a little research before coming here and sitting down to make this video, and so we might come back to that if I can remember to complain about that. But you know, just once we get past this like idea that you're trying to make it seem like Buddhism is not a religion, and actually it's more like atheism, and that theism apparently just means Abrahamic faiths, which it does not, then the answer is probably theism. Because again, you're the odd one out. You can say all day long, oh, ghosts are silly, angels are silly, demons are silly, gods are silly. Okay, why do they appear in virtually every single culture's folklore then? If we're looking for an explanation either atheistic or theistic, then what's the explanation? Because if you do your research, the only plausible secular theory is that all of the world's religions stem from one singular pre-Proto-Indo-European religion. The alternative to that is actually more reasonable by virtue of Occam's razor, so long as you aren't approaching this from the preconceived notion that metaphysical doctrine and supernatural phenomena is silly. And it's just that this is multiple discovery. These are different cultures having their own interpretations of complex truths that they can't really convey. And so that's how you get these differences between religions, because they're not really all that different when you start to study them. You can look at polytheistic religions and say, oh, but they believe in multiple gods, except it's usually a hierarchy of the gods in which there is a supreme god. And a monotheistic religion like Christianity, for example, demon comes from daemon. It literally means lesser god. Now, obviously, Christians aren't going to think of demons as gods, but inarguably, they are lesser spiritual entities. And clearly, there is the belief among Christians, many will say that Baal, for example, an Old Testament god of pagans, was a demon. And so demons present themselves as gods, and that's how you can rationalize that the two things are really just different interpretations of the same story. Buddhism comes from Hinduism. You have devas, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, and these are gods. Buddha is a transcendental supreme being. People can say that there are not gods in Buddhism, but that's not entirely true. According to Oxford, a god is just a superhuman being or spirit worshipped as having power over nature or human fortunes. And so here, where this says Buddhists do not believe in any kind of god or deity, although there are supernatural figures who can help or hinder people on the path towards enlightenment, that's just cognitive dissonance. You can't say there are supernatural beings who help the fortunes of man, but those aren't gods. No, in polytheistic religions, that's what the definition of God is. And theism is just the belief in a god or gods. And you can say especially belief in one god as the creator of the universe, intervening in it and sustaining personal relation to his creatures. But for one, just because a definition says especially doesn't mean necessarily. It doesn't have to be that is the case. It's just the truer that is, the more theistic it is. And so I would agree, Buddhism is not super theistic, but I really don't like how people are defining it as non-theistic. It's not non-theistic, it is theistic. And even for argument's sake, assuming that it isn't, because essentially we're just arguing labels here, this is a terrible argument, which again is just predicated on conflating Christianity, and actually even a specific interpretation of Christianity, with theism in general. Because if we just understand theism as the category to which all theistic religions belong, then in order to say that theism is true, we only need to say that some sort of God exists or some sort of supernatural order exists such that there are supernatural beings that people can worship. Then the fact that pretty much everybody on the earth besides you has had these multiple discoveries that such beings do exist, that makes me more inclined to believe that they're at least observing something that they could be misinterpreting as more mystical, but something at the very least has to exist in order for them to come up with these stories.
Well, let's consider our two competing hypotheses. Could it be that God does exist, but that the Thai are simply naturally 20 times more likely to be resistant to belief in God than, say, the Saudis? Are they just naturally 20 times more stubborn or something? This seems implausible. This doesn't seem to be their fault. Okay, so maybe then it's not their fault, and God just has some reason to hide his face disproportionately more from the Thai than from Saudis, or indeed from those born here in Massachusetts, which, according to one statistic, is 75% theistic. If theism is true, it seems to me that God has a lot to answer for here. Is it not troubling, as a Christian, that your place of birth is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved? I'll say that again. Your place of birth, which is entirely arbitrary, is a reliable indicator of how likely you are on Christianity to be saved. You're significantly more likely to be a theist if you're born in Rwanda than if you're born in Thailand. Can this situation really obtain under the supervision of a God who wants to come to know us and makes his existence equally accessible to all? The chances seem infinitely small. Now consider naturalism or atheism. Religion varying by region is exactly what we would expect if it is a man-made cultural phenomenon, and nothing like what we should expect
if there is, in fact, one true God who loves all equally. Again, I think atheism provides a much stronger account of this fact of our world.
And so there you have it, like what I said at the beginning. It's a completely reasonable argument in parts, but it just comes to a completely unnatural conclusion, because he's conflating Christianity with other religions. Atheism is only true if there are no gods or no God. You can't just stand there and say, isn't it concerning that if there is a singular God, according to Christianity, who wants a personal relationship with people, that, he doesn't have this personal relationship with people. That's a criticism of Christianity, not a criticism of theism in general. And if we're being entirely honest, again, I don't even know if it's a criticism of Christianity in general, if not just specific interpretations of Christianity. There are Christians who have very fatalist perspectives of who is a Christian and who is not a Christian, who is saved and who will be saved and who is not going to be saved. You can walk up to them and say, hey, this is an issue where other people across the world are not going to be saved, and then they'll just repeat God's plan. Which isn't necessarily to say that that's a good argument, that's a good response, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't understand why you would want to waste an argument by just making it into something that it's not. I think, for example, for me, when I make this argument, I don't say, oh, well, your God can't exist. But at the end of the day, I think at the very least I have to concede, a more plausible argument, which is this. I can't convince an all-knowing God with false faith. And so to Christians who don't come from that fatalist perspective that God has already written everybody down in the book of life and it's all just predetermined, how can I have a chance at salvation when I can't make myself believe? And when largely, whether or not you are in an environment where it's easy to come to faith is based on where you are born. That is a better argument than just like, oh, well, there are other religions. Yours is wrong. Because it's a frustrating thing that atheists do, and especially determinist atheists, because you would have to imagine that Alex O'Connor here, just having said that free will doesn't exist, he would have to accept, right, that his beliefs as an atheist are predetermined by prior material conditions. Where he was born, and the things he was taught, and the things that he learned are just as much an indicator of what he believes as an atheist as it is being born in a Christian country or not being born in a Christian country. But that's just kind of the pride of these secular dogmatists, these Reddit atheists. They're never going to acknowledge that because that's an obvious contradiction in their beliefs. And it's not as though their belief system is about dispelling these contradictions and having a logically consistent position. If you're a Reddit atheist, it's all just about explaining away your preconceived notions as truth. That's why they do things like conflating theism with Christianity. There are other forms of theism. Assuming that this video was a good argument against Christianity, which I would say that it doesn't, but just for argument's sake, if this did disprove Christianity, you didn't prove that an atheistic interpretation of the world is better than a theistic one. You just disproved Christianity. Because if you read the Old Testament, the Jews believed that they were God's chosen ones. So the argument of, oh, well, all these other places, they didn't have the equal whatever. It's yeah, because that's not what God does. If Judaism is true, which to an extent this principle would be subsumed somewhat by Christianity, obviously there is salvation of Gentiles, but still this would be true in the Old Testament, that God is a being that just chooses a group of people and says, you're my favorite. I pick you to be my representatives in the world. So you're never really going to be able to use this as an internal critique against Christianity, against Judaism, against any other Abrahamic faith, because a lot of them do believe that they are the chosen ones. That's literally what the Israelites were. And so if the Bible is true, we know that God is willing to do that. So pretty weak argument. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to accomplish, and there's a bit wrong with it. Not as bad as the other videos, but it's still bad. And speaking of bad, let's talk about Destiny, because apparently I would be able to find a lot of common ground and talk out our differences. Just roll the clip.
The entire world would be better off if these people were permanently removed from these platforms. There is no downside and only upside to see people like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Tim Pool never be allowed to publicly broadcast their opinions ever again.
That, ladies and gentlemen, that raving lunatic who thinks anyone who disagrees with him should be deplatformed, that is someone I have a lot in common with, and I could easily, we could talk and just work through our differences. What? No, this comment had to be satire, right? This This was satirical, right? Not too long ago, this guy got in trouble for saying that he was glad that a Trump supporter got shot at a rally. You bootlickers of Destiny can be like, oh, no, you're misinterpreting what he's saying, blah, 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 blah. He said something completely reasonable. But, like, at the very least, I think you have to concede that he said he's going to joke about if his conservative followers get shot or get killed. He'd joke about you guys dying the same way. And so you think, like, what special relationship do you think we're going to have? Like, this is why in my first React video I said I didn't want to form parasocial relationships with people online. Not only because of what I'm about to say, but because I now have to make fun of the person who made this comment, and that person's gonna feel bad, and I'm gonna feel not really that bad, to be honest. But the way I think about people who leave comments like this is as follows, right? I of course, am playing the role of the person who left the comment. The Iron Spider Spider-Man is me because he's cool. The Venom Symbiote Spider-Man, that I think is a McDonald's toy, is Destiny because he's evil. And action. Hey Destiny, I think we should be friends because we're kind of similar to each other. Oh my god, what are you talking about? That's literally not true. That's, what are you even talking about? Oh my god. No, think about it, Destiny. Someone who's pretty cool said that we're alike, and if you think about it, like, I talk about classical liberalism a lot. You pretend to be a moderate liberal, or at least people online characterize you as a more moderate liberal in order to excuse your extremist beliefs. I don't know, you're starting to make sense to me. You're kind of stupid though. Oh yeah, blah blah blah. John Locke, blah blah blah. Hobbes, blah blah blah. Enlightenment era philosophy. Actually, you know what? I have a more nuanced perspective of the world now, thanks to this guy. Thank you too. I'm so glad that you could. Wait, Destiny, what are you doing? Get it? Because there's that video of him going around sucking dick. Point being, it feels like childlike admiration of two people who couldn't be more different. Like, in reality, I have 1,000 followers here on YouTube. Sure, I have like 100,000 followers on TikTok. But, like, first and foremost, the idea that it would even be in Destiny's interest to interact with me, absurd. And then more than that, you think we would get along because of your perceptions of us, not because of who we actually are. I think a lot of people may point to this video that we just showed and say, oh, well, aren't you kind of pro-censorship too? You don't believe in absolute freedom of speech. And the answer to that is yes, but the funny thing is, like, if you think that I'm like Destiny, then you don't understand my position at all. My position is not we should censor people who disagree with me or who are wrong. My position is more like, hey, under the current law, it is illegal to threaten violence. Marxists are revolutionaries. They want to overthrow the existing social order. That is implicitly a threat of violence. And during McCarthy-era politics, we put Marxists in prison. There is plenty of logic here, plenty of precedent here to say Marxists should be imprisoned. That is not the same as saying that people who are wrong should be imprisoned. For example, ironically, of the people Destiny lists out, I don't like Tucker Carlson. I have mostly positive opinions on Tim Pool. I do not like Candace Owens, and frankly, he may have me there that Candace Owens is a good example of someone who should be censored, but Tucker Carlson is not. When Candace Owens says something like a secret cabal of Jews is running the world, I've paraphrased there, but essentially what she said, we can look at concepts like mens rea, we can look at concepts like intent, and we can say that the consequence of that is knowingly contributing to anti-Semitic beliefs and anti-Semitic violence against Jewish people. And I think in that, you could make a decent argument towards censorship. Tucker Carlson, for example, on the other hand, he says ridiculous things, sure. He'll go to Russia and he doesn't understand the power of the dollar. And so he'll say, look, everything's cheaper here. Even though the average income there is less, which means the purchasing power is less, so the food is actually more expensive proportionally. And we can look at that and we can say, that's basic economics. How do you not understand basic economics? How do you not have anyone in your entourage to make sure that you're not putting out false information? We can condemn him. We can say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And we could probably even say that as a consequence of what he says, he is a danger to society. He has made people more pro-Putin, more pro-Russia. But ultimately, all of that comes to a head when we ask, well, what objective standard do we have to say this speech is acceptable and this speech is not? And I'm not talking about the absurd argument people make about how, oh, well, who decides what is and is not acceptable speech? No, I'm saying that there could be an objective standard. All you need to do is tell me what that standard is. And in that, it cannot just be the consequence of an action. Because if it is, then, as a thought experiment, we can say, oh, well, you said the Earth is round. And by virtue of the butterfly effect, that created the next Hitler. That's absurd. You can deal with consequence, but you just have to deal with consequence that is coupled with intent. Or I should say mens rea, what a rational person should know that their actions accomplish. And so in that, whenever I talk about censorship, aside from challenging violent rhetoric, the furthest I ever get is just saying that any statement that is built on the premise of denying the very nature of reality, that is speech that should theoretically be censored. Whether or not it makes sense on a large scale to do that censorship, I don't know, but we need to stop pretending that it's inherently a bad thing. If it's subjectivist, if it's the materialist one-to-one thinking that I'm always talking about, if it's postmodernism, if it's Marxism, these are things that you can and should censor because they don't make any sense, and they, more importantly, cannot make sense. And that is different from being an advocate of censoring anytime someone says something stupid, like when Tucker Carlson says, oh, I'm an American First Patriot, and talking about Israel is bad because we have issues going on over here. Goes to Canada, goes to Russia, starts talking about Gaza once Israel starts winning. I'm an American First Patriot, but I believe the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bad because that's necessary for me to believe in order to continue my delusions about Gaza. Because if you're an American First Patriot, what obligation do you think we had to Japan in order to continue the war to minimize their casualties? They should just not be at war with us. That's America First, saying, hey, no more American lives, nuke, nuke. That's America First. But anyways, I'll come back to this because I actually have a video in the pipeline talking about Tucker Carlson. I might include Candace Owens, I'm not sure. Sometimes I'm way too long-winded, and it's going to be enough to just to talk about Tucker. The point is, the censorship I believe in and the censorship Destiny believes in are not the same. Not only because he would probably want to censor me, which, to be fair, given the violent nature of his rhetoric now, the feeling would be mutual, because I used to actually say that he was an example of someone I wouldn't censor, but now that's not true. And just also, obviously, there's the differences that I outlined in this entire rant. I want to move on to this, because I actually found this today when I was looking for this previous video, and I think it's interesting.
Nobody wants to hear it, but there's a reason why people engage in that type of rhetoric. Do you think it was an effective political tactic when people made gay jokes about Paul Pelosi? It was, because they make memes out of it, they laugh about it, it boosts morale. There is an advantage to it. And to pretend that it's strictly negative doesn't make any sense, because if so, where is the right suffering for?
The 2020 election. I mean, like, for example, you could call this anecdotal, but this is the feeling I've found that most have. I didn't go out and vote because I didn't like the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Virtually everyone I know who is a conservative says they do not like the rhetoric of Donald Trump. I have no idea where Destiny is getting this take from.
Donald Trump is literally a guy who gives bad nicknames to his political opponents. And I'm so sick of this, like, but don't you think it's bad when you make fun of blah, blah? Show me these conversations happening on the right, because this conversation that's happening right now is never happening on Tucker Carlson, on Joe Rogan, on Tim Pool, on Candace Owens, on Ben Shapiro, on Walsh, on Knowles, on Crowder, on any of these other shows, on Megyn Kelly, on any, none of these people are like, well, were we too mean when we did this? They're not even close to these guys.
Okay, so I don't know about Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, whatever. This is constantly happening with me, and it's annoying. I think most recently I have a TikTok titled Tolerance Paradox. Here is a comment from a follower of mine. But who decides who is intolerant? There also were downsides to jailing communists, in that now it's used as an empathetic symbol for this generation through the boogeyman of McCarthyism. So there you go, Destiny. Like, this was, what, a week ago? I mean, I'm struggling to find others here, but that's literally just because I've had to tone down my rhetoric, because if I don't, every single video will be some LARPer conservative being like, you're being too mean to these people who think we should die. And so basically everything Destiny said there, I can say the same thing, except just the exact opposite. I wish I heard leftists talking about how they need to be nicer to conservatives. I don't hear that ever. And I hear nothing but conservatives crying about how we need to be nicer. We can't stoop to their level. And it's just stupid. And I guess this is what people are talking about, because I absolutely agree with Destiny here. It's insane. When Destiny says that he would laugh if people like me die, I don't think that's a person I should be nice to. Like, why? So I don't really have any input for Destiny here other than, please, keep doing what you're doing right now, because it makes people like me sound more reasonable. Because leftists try to use this, like, they started at logic, the same logic that a lot of people mistakenly accuse me of. And anytime you guys try to give an example, like here with Destiny, it's Nancy Pelosi's husband. And I'm sorry to say this, but like, Big whoop. I'm so sick and tired of that being the example. Like, you guys all accept that Nancy Pelosi is the devil. All other Democrats are like, yeah, she's an insider trader. She doesn't represent the will of the people. And that's where conservatives are coming from when they make fun of her and her husband. It isn't that, like, she's on the other side of the aisle. It's that she's a criminal. Or at least should be a criminal, and in an ideal world should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And, like, I don't know anyone besides, like, people who have to LARP and pretend to be, like, moderate liberals who would argue against that. The rest of the grounded working class would agree, hey, this is a bad person. It's funny when bad things happen to bad people. It's called karma. I would even understand it if Donald Trump was assassinated and you made fun of that. I would still use that as the obvious example that it is, that you guys are unhinged and, like, you just don't care about having civil conversations anymore. But at least that's miles above making fun of a man who died trying to protect his family. The man who used himself as a shield in the audience for his family. That's just disgusting, and you're not a person who deserves to be tolerated, who deserves to be treated well, who deserves to be treated like a human being, to be honest, because you don't treat others like human beings. And that's where people are coming from. Not whatever delusion you've created to think that we're the bad guys for believing that your rhetoric is extreme. Because like I said earlier, I essentially can sit here with a mere experience of you, where I have never seen leftists step up to the bat and say, hey, we need to take the moral high road and actually try to have a civil conversation. And I have only ever seen conservatives do that to the point where it's annoying because I'm only ever talking about extremists. But even those extremists, and especially people who aren't extremists, I don't wish death upon them. I wouldn't be happy if any one of them died, but you are. And if anyone has any question about why I'm in the right and why he's in the wrong, and why I think he should be censored and why I should not be censored, it's that. It is as clear as day that. I guess I would be willing to have a conversation with Destiny, but he's not a rational person. For example, his belief in censorship from the first video demonstrates the same lack of understanding of ethics that we're going to see in this next video.
Destiny, since you hold there is no consciousness at conception personhood, do you believe a woman should be able to drink and smoke from the earliest point of pregnancy if she doesn't get an abortion?
I would say no, because you're committing harm to a future person.
Whoa!
Whoa! I'm sorry, but that's just kind of like, that's kind of corny. They go, whoa!
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 So is it committing harm to a future person to dismember them at 19 weeks?
No, because you're preventing that future person from existing.
Okay.
That last part is valid. That's not an overreaction. It's a really bizarre thing to say, but if you actually understand why Destiny is saying it, it makes perfect sense. Again, I'm not saying that it's logical. I'm examining why his logic is flawed and seeing that it's at least consistent with itself. The problem with Destiny is he just doesn't understand ethics. He is very clearly a staunch consequentialist, and the issue with that is that only, like, children and people with mental disabilities are probably staunch consequentialists. The idea from the first video was, well, what's the negative consequence of censoring these people? There's nothing. It's only beneficial. To which a rational person could easily reply, even if that's true, what right do we have to censor these people? And that's how you get into a conversation of deontology about what obligations people have to act or not act. And so if people are knowingly contributing to violence, that is something that they have an obligation to not do. If people think that they're telling the truth, but they just happen to be wrong, that's not something that people have an obligation to not do. But obviously, if you're a staunch consequentialist, you don't draw this line in the sand and say, this is acceptable speech, this is not. Any speech that contributes negatively to society is negative speech, and there's no problem with censoring it. Although I guess I should give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe this clip was taken out of context, and maybe he says, we don't have a right to do it, but it is still the good thing to do. You know, whatever way he could have possibly explained it, but still. Here, he is saying that if you mutilate a child that you know is going to be born and you allow to be born, that is immoral, that should be prohibited because you are harming a future person. He then turns around and says, well, no, abortion shouldn't be prohibited because if you abort a fetus, then it's not going to become a future person, and so you're not harming a future person. This may seem bizarre to people who understand rights or understand the obligation to act, but to people who only see, like, the consequences of an action and harm as being the only things to consider when forming ethical principles, this makes perfect sense. If you're a staunch consequentialist, then not having a child is the same as, if you believe that personhood does not begin at conception, terminating a pregnancy. Because in both the consequence of action or inaction is that a person is not created. And so not having children is morally permissible. So terminating them by this strict consequentialist perspective should be as well. And from that same perspective, that's different than not having a child and having a child that you disfigure. So the problem is having a strict consequentialist perspective. That doesn't make any sense. Similar to the free speech argument I made earlier, the issue comes from, like, the butterfly effect. What differentiates a benign, thing from something that is immoral? And, most consequentialists understand this, and so they're going to be extreme in their beliefs, but they're going to have some excuses for their beliefs. Destiny, for example, may not even think that he's a consequentialist. He may say that butterfly effect arguments don't work because you can't possibly be held responsible for something that you don't know is going to transpire. And so what happens in these pro-choice arguments that use this consequentialist framework is that they choose to ignore that we know that the consequence of an abortion is harmful, that it is intended to cause harm, and that's not even something you can argue. You can say, for example, that I don't have an obligation to give you a gift. So not giving someone a gift is not immoral. And in terms of how this analogizes abortion, we can say that only until you get a gift can I steal it from you. In the same way, you say here, this unborn fetus does not have personhood, but here this is a child. The issue with that is that if I know that you're going to get a gift, and I prevent you from getting a gift, that is not the same as not getting you a gift. Morally, that is somewhere in between not getting you a gift and stealing a gift from you. And in many ways, it's more like stealing a gift from you. When you get an abortion, you're not just doing it with the intent of not having a child. That is an intent there. But you are also doing it with the knowledge that if you do not act, a person will come into existence. That's the very reason that you're getting an abortion. And so this argument fails because you can't just say, well, you're not causing harm to a future being because there will be no future being. No, you're acting with the intent to deprive the future being of the life that he would have had. And in many ways, that's why murder against people who are born is immoral. When you emphasize harm against conscious beings, that doesn't really make any sense. If I were to atomize you such that you were never aware of the fact that you were being harmed, would that be moral? No. A person does not need to be aware of the fact that you harmed him or her in order for murder to be immoral. Again, it is immoral because you are ending that person's life. Nothing more, nothing less. Obviously, harming people is immoral, but it's not immoral for the same reason that murder is immoral. If when you killed somebody, they just respawned, it wouldn't be the same as murder, now would it? It wouldn't be treated the same. We wouldn't view it ethically as being the same. And so here, unfortunately for Destiny, but thankfully for morality, it is just as immoral to end the life of a potential person as it is to end the life of an actual person, because they're both immoral for the same reason. You're depriving both of the potential life that they could have had. And we are specifically saying this in terms of mens rea and the intent we have to act. Because, for example, take Destiny's argument that you're not harming a future person. If I give you a button that will kill a person, but it's on a delay such that it will only kill the person a minute after it is pressed, is it immoral to press the button? Many of us will have said, yes, it is immoral to press the button. And we say this regardless of whether or not that person will continue to live within that minute. Because in order for what Destiny is saying to be true, you could press the button, by some means the person dies, and suddenly you're not culpable for murder after having pressed a button that you knew would kill a person. Simply because you're no longer capable of harming a future person, because there is no future person there. The future person died. The future person no longer exists. You didn't harm a person, you harmed a corpse, just like you would have harmed a clump of cells. That's not a person. You can't just think in terms of the consequence of your action, or in terms of some excuse that you use to kind of think in the consequence of your actions, but not really. You have to think about what obligations you have to act or not act. And so, at the end of the day, controversially, you have an obligation to not kill babies. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that hurts your feelings, Destiny, but you don't understand ethics. And, yeah. I really still don't know how to end videos, so I guess I'll just sum this up by saying, if you guys want to see more confrontational stuff like this, let me know. Otherwise, I might not do this again for a while. I don't feel like this went well, but to be fair, that's mostly just because I'm sick right now, so who knows. But, yeah, I still don't know how to end a video, so the video's over now.